Hello, Mark.
Hi there, Rupert.
Um, Today, as a part of our ongoing series of discussions, I wanted to talk about end of life experiences in animals. This may seem a surprising topic, but the reason I'm interested in it is that um, I've been interested for a long time, but we've just had a paper come out, co-authored by with my assistant Pam Smart, who's worked with me for many years, and Michael Nahm, who works in Freiburg in Germany. And so this is our paper that's just come out in the Journal of Scientific Exploration, Experiences of Dying Animals, Parallels with End-of-Life Experiences in Humans. And, and this is part of a research uh, area that's been growing in recent years, study of end-of-life experiences, what happens when people are near death. Now, there's been an interest for many years in near-death experiences, and there's been a huge literature on this, the experiences of people who almost die and experience themselves going out of their bodies. They often find themselves looking down on themselves, going through a kind of tunnel into a realm of peace and joy where they often meet deceased relatives or loved ones or beings of light. And then, of course, they have to come back because it's only a near-death experience. Well, that's one feature of end-of-life experiences, or that's near end-of-life or experiences. It's not actually end-of-life because it's only near death, they come back. But there's also been studies on other aspects of people nearing the end of their life. And one of the most striking findings, which has been named by Michael Nahm, my colleague, as terminal lucidity, is the way in which some people who have had dementia or who've been otherwise severely disabled, soon before they die, become really clear. They know who people are. They remember things that they've apparently forgotten for years. They become present, completely present. And my interest in this was triggered really by the experience with my own brother, Andrew, who died a couple of years ago, having had several years of severe dementia. And when I visited him in that state, he really couldn't say much. He didn't talk much. He didn't really know what was going on. Um, but I visited him just very soon before he died, and it was a completely different experience. He was totally present. He looked me in the eyes. I felt this immediate connection. I mean, a stronger connection than I felt probably since we were children. Um, and I knew something extraordinary had happened, and it was a remarkable experience for me, and I think for him. And shortly afterwards, he died. So this made it a personal matter for me, learning more about terminal lucidity. And it's interesting for several reasons. One is it enables people to say goodbye who their families may have given up on in terms of being able to communicate. Um, and secondly, from a theoretical point of view, it's very interesting because if people's memories if they've lost their memories, the usual assumption is that the brain degeneration that occurs in Alzheimer's disease and other forms of dementia has wiped out the memories, which are usually assumed to be stored in the brain. But if they can have this recovery of memory, it shows the memories weren't wiped out, that what may have been wiped out was the ability to retrieve the memories, and that somehow comes back for unknown reasons. So that's interesting from a theoretical point of view. I myself don't think memories are stored in the brain, but given by morphic resonance, as you know. So now, what happened then is that I have a large database of stories about animals, more than 6,000 case histories. People write in with these stories. And my associate, Pam Smart, classifies them, and we have dozens of categories, and we have all these stories on our database. And over the years, we have a category for end-of-life experiences, and I hadn't paid much attention to it. But when I looked at it, I found that we had over 100 cases that have accumulated. And looking through them, there are remarkable parallels to end-of-life experiences with humans. One of the features of end-of-life experiences is a surge of energy, sometimes called the last rally. In the 19th century literature, it's called the last rally. Sometimes people working in hospices or nurses use that term today. In Spanish, they have a term for this, la mejoría de la muerte, the improvement of death. So there are various terms for this in humans, but something similar seems to be happening in animals. And we found a number of categories of animal behavior in dying animals reported by their owners or by vets, which are strikingly parallel to the similar things in humans, like the last rally. And one striking feature, which we have quite a number of examples of, is called the last goodbye. I'll just read one example, or maybe two examples. These are mostly with dogs and cats. There are some of these stories are with parrots, some are with horses and other animals. Here's one about a dog. A few years ago, our Staffordshire bulldog, Petey, fell terminally ill. 1 hour before he died, he came to each member of the family and spent a little time with everybody, one at a time. We thought this behavior was odd, as he didn't usually do this, at least not to each individual person at one time. He seemed alive and much more energetic than he had been, being so ill. After spending a bit of time with each of us, he made his way downstairs to his bed and died peacefully. And here's another one. This is the sad but true story of what our family experienced with our dog, Foxy. We all loved the dog because it was so friendly, devoted and loyal, as well as very watchful and clever. When the dog became old, it could not hear so well anymore. Ate less and became weak. Finally, at the age of 14, it could hardly move from its resting place. Then one day the following happened. The whole family sat at the dinner table when the good dog struggled to its feet, went around from one to the next, sadly looked at everybody, gave paws to each member of the family, then it trudged back, slowly lay down and died. You can believe me, we had tears in our eyes after this goodbye scene. The dog had felt the end and pulled itself together for a final goodbye to all of us. So there's this ability that animals seem to have, firstly, to know when they're about to die, and secondly, to have a surge of energy, mental energy and physical energy, which seems to be part of the dying process. And why we think this is interesting in the animal cases is they're so similar to the human cases. Previously, people thought this was just a feature of human dying. But the fact it happens with so many animals, non-human animals, suggests that there's some biological basis for this, that dying animals may feel different. There may be a change in physiology just shortly before death. That's a deep-seated biological feature. In our stories, we have it in both mammals and birds. I don't know about reptiles and fish, but at least with the examples we have are from mammals and birds, it may be something quite deep and biological. And human end-of-life experiences fit into that general pattern. So that's what I wanted to bring up today.
Yeah, so maybe just an initial thought is that in the case of human beings, this is something that's personal to me as well, because my mother died too young of a cancer. And so whilst it wasn't a brain disease that killed her, she was unconscious essentially for the last day or more of her life. and one of my family members, we all gathered on her last day, and one of my family members couldn't stay because of commitments with her children. And we weren't sure, when my mother would die, of course. And my mother had been unconscious for many hours by this stage. And so my sister went to her, the bedside, to hold her hand and make her personal goodbye. But in that moment, my mother woke up, sat up, and said, "It's okay, you can go now." And so let my sister go. And it was, and then quite quickly became unconscious again, and then died actually a few hours later. So it was a very remarkable moment in the dying process of my mother as well. And I know also that some of the big palliative care charities that particularly look after people who have terminal conditions, they are actively researching actually this phenomenon, because they want to make sure that the care they offer, particularly when it comes to medication, doesn't sort of overwrite the possibility of these last goodbyes, these rallies. It's very, very widely recognized amongst nurses and others that look after people in the hours, days before they die. So this is, something which is actually widely known, I think, in this whole area. And it's great that people are starting to actively think about it, because, there has been a tendency to just medicalize the last hours of death and before death. And, with perfectly good reason and the desire to care, but to try and get it right so that you don't miss what can be very powerful and healing moments for all concerned is really important.
Yes. Well, interesting, isn't it, that the people in the hospice movement who, on a regular basis, are dealing with people dying, are really paying attention to this. Thank goodness they are. That's, I think there are two things that come out of this research that might be relevant to actual practice. One is this lucidity that comes to people when they're nearly dying, and the last goodbyes. With these animals, one of the major themes that shines through these cases is how many of them, the animals, want to say a last goodbye. That it's remarkable. They like these examples I read. It's quite clearly a kind of last goodbye, and that we have examples with cats where they go round the members of the family, sit in their lap for a few minutes, and then move to the next one, and it's clearly saying goodbye. Well, in hospice situation where where they use opioids like morphine to reduce the pain of dying, I suppose one danger is that if people are over medicated, then this lucidity that comes before death may be masked or even suppressed by the powerful effects of these drugs. And so I suppose that one of the things is to strike the right balance so that there's enough medication to prevent unnecessary pain, but not too much to prevent these very important abilities to be clearer just before dying and to say goodbye. And another theme that emerges from these stories is that one of the themes that we identified in these stories was retreating into solitude. There's particularly cats, when they're about to die, some of them seem to have an urge to retreat into solitude, to go into the garden, to hide in some bushes and die there, away from the house. And I suspect that may be a pattern with quite a number of wild animals. If a wild animal is dying in the nest or the den or whatever, it would be a problem for the others after it's died. They'd have to remove a dead body, which might otherwise decay and spoil their normal resting place and so on. And so for evolutionary reasons, it's possible that animals go away to die, retreat into solitude and die away from the others. And this is something that some dogs and quite a number of cats seem to want to do. They often don't have the chance because they're in indoors and they can't get out. But there's also, among dying people, there are quite a number of stories about people who are dying and the family around them and everyone's around them, and all the nurses are in the room and stuff. And then when people have left the room, maybe to go to the toilet or for a meeting or something with a doctor or something, the people die then when they're alone. And it could be that there, for some people at least, there's a basic urge to die alone, which it may be deeply instinctive and coming from our animal heritage, going off into solitude to die, rather than the Victorian deathbed scene with absolutely everyone around the bed and sort of enormous social event death. For some people, it may be preferable to do it alone, because there are certain things people prefer doing alone. And I don't know enough about it because I haven't worked in hospices and things to know how common this is, but it's certainly something that studying these animal cases made me much more aware of. And so it may not be appropriate for absolutely everyone to have constant company while they're dying. They may want to have moments when they can be alone. And
yeah, there's a couple of thoughts there. I mean, I think certainly it's anecdotal, but from my own knowledge of what happens in hospices and around care, it's very common again to hear stories of people who said their goodbye, the relatives left thinking they'd be back in the morning, say, and then the person dies alone overnight or quite quickly, after the departure of their relatives. And so that would resonate with what you're saying there. The other thing that occurs to me is maybe complementing the deep evolutionary side of it. I wonder too whether people, as they approach death, as it were, the veil between this life and what happens next becomes much thinner, and people are already beginning to move into the space of what comes next. Certainly, with near-death experiences, it's very common to hear of people who have had these experiences, maybe going through the tunnel, being in places of peace and joy, and then being told, no, now is not their time, and so they must come back. And certainly the idea that the veil between life and death, sometimes, with working with much older people, even if they aren't ill, there's a sense that actually they're kind of living in between zones, in fact. And so they feel the pull of what happens next quite as much as the sense of their mortal lives. And that can even be painful for relatives because they feel like they're losing the person. But actually what's happening, certainly as people have described it, is that they're realizing that life is bigger than just their mortal life, and they're feeling the transition to that wider life. And so what looks like a desire to be alone could also be the stepping into this wider life, which of course is leaving mortal life behind, as the people who have the near-death experiences would describe it. So maybe there's complementing the evolutionary, maybe more sort of practical side. There is also a hint there of what comes, what follows on the other side of death, that people start to experience even before they've died.
Well, that seems to be the case, as you say, with people who work in hospices and who've seen a lot of people die. And this is something Peter and Elizabeth Fenwick write about in their book on the art of dying. Peter Fenwick, who is the president of the Scientific and Medical Network, who's a psychiatrist and who spent many years together with his wife Elizabeth studying death and phenomena related to death and deathbed situations, says that many people, when they're dying, seem to be seeing visions or sometimes even talk to people who aren't there, like dead relatives, as if they're already opening up to another realm of conscious experience that's associated with dying or death or beyond death. And some seem blissfully happy and joyful, and sometimes this joy spreads to those around them, as if they're anticipating a kind of post-mortal altered state of consciousness. Um, so that does seem to be quite a general pattern. Um, and it relates to another phenomenon which is being researched at the moment with people, and which I and my colleagues are doing something about with animals at the moment, which is the so-called literature on after-death contacts. Um, about 50% of people who are bereaved who've had a long-term relationship, for example, married people who've lost a husband or a wife, um, have the experience of a contact with the person after they've died. I'm not now referring to going to spirit mediums and who then channel the dead person, but spontaneous events when they either see once or more the person who's died as a kind of apparition, they just appear, um, or smell them, sometimes the smell of characteristic tobacco or perfume or something, or hear them, hear their voice, or feel their presence, and in bed and suddenly feel they're being hugged by their dead spouse. And for most people who've had these after-death contacts, it's enormously reassuring. Most people deal with the bereavement process better after these contacts. And when this was first noticed or written about in about 20 years ago by a Welsh doctor who called Rees, who some of his patients told him about this, and he then made a point of asking bereaved patients about it. And most people didn't talk about it. Most of them said they'd never told anyone because they didn't want to be thought mad or schizophrenic or hearing voices or seeing apparitions. They thought these would be treated as symptoms of madness. So most people were relieved to be able to talk about it because they hadn't been able to talk about it before. And he found about 50% of bereaved people had had this experience. And subsequent work on after-death contacts has shown, yes, it is indeed really quite common. I mean, this has lots of implications. I mean, you could say these are just hallucinations based on memories of the person, and they're comforting to the people who've had them because it's all produced inside their head as hallucinations. And that's obviously what the skeptics, materialists, and atheists are going to say. But that's not how it seems to people who experience these things, and it does have a powerful effect for them. What we found is looking at these cases with animals, very similar things happen with beloved dogs, cats, or other animals. People see them, feel their presence. For example, with cats, one of the more common phenomena is that the deceased cat is gone, but it's a cat that normally would have jumped up on somebody's bed and sort of in the morning and snuggled up with them. And people feel the cat jump up onto the bed. And of course, it's not really the cat, it's a kind of phantasm of the deceased cat. But this feeling of animals or seeing them, again, very similar things happen with animals as they do with people. We're going through this at the moment. We're planning to write a paper on this subject as a sequel to our one on end-of-life experiences. So I think this is a very interesting area of research, which until recently was more or less ignored. But now that it's been given a name, after-death contacts, just like near-death experiences had always been going on, but once it's given a name, it's easier to talk about it. And terminal lucidity, no doubt, has always gone on, but once it's got a name, it's easier to identify the phenomenon. And giving this the name of after-death contacts enables us to see the phenomenon more clearly.
Yeah, no, I think I can understand that. And as you're talking, it reminds me of one of the best books to date that I think has been written on this by the journalist Leslie Kean, called Surviving Death. And actually, it was also turned into a Netflix series. And she looks at various types of contact with people who have died. from accounts of reincarnation through near-death experiences, mediumship, and also after-death contact. And she kind of says there's loads of anecdotal evidence, even good studies. She feels that mediumship is much harder to assess because it so very substantially varies the quality of the mediumship, whereas things like near-death experiences and even after-death encounters, they're much better cases because you can quantify and qualify what happens much more clearly. But one of the things which she concludes is that there are always alternative explanations. And I wonder particularly what you make of this in your work, because one of the possibilities is that it's actually memories returning to the person, and maybe, you know, memories that are reenacted in the case of the sense of someone's died being present, you know, the hug in the bed or the smell and so on. This may not be indicative of them on the other side communicating, but maybe just a very, well, I say just, maybe a powerful memory of that person that, for example, could be held within a morphic field if memories aren't held in the brain. You know, maybe that these kind of fields have a dynamism of their own, and that is what the person is experiencing after someone has died. And so I wonder whether you have thought about how to, you know, tease out these possible explanations, and whether the evidence you gather gives any indicators on that front.
Well, I mean, the memory hypothesis is obviously is a fairly straightforward one, and I think it would be rather hard to tell. I mean, there's certainly the people who experience these things don't think it's just some kind of memory flashback. They feel there's a real presence, a sense of presence, and that is very comforting. Now, the fact it's comforting doesn't necessarily prove anything one way or the other. And so one has to leave it open, I think. I mean, I can't, we're just starting this research, so I haven't read through all these cases yet. We have well over 100 in our collection. So, you know, there may be some that will enable us to shed a light on that. But in terms of alternative explanations, I think one of the most radical implications of this is religious. And I'm thinking here of the resurrection of Jesus. What happens after the crucifixion and the resurrection, which is such a central part of Christianity, is that disciples and people who were very close to Jesus, and Mary Magdalene first, and then the disciples, and then other people, mostly disciples, see him. He appears to them. He speaks to them. They hear his voice. He appears in closed rooms, manifests, and then vanishes again. I mean, it's clearly not a regular physical body. I mean, the descriptions in the New Testament of the appearances of Jesus suggest that this was not a regular physical body. It wasn't even somebody pretending to be Jesus walking into the room and walking out. The door was locked and he can appear and disappear. So now these look very much like after-death contacts. And so the normal approach to these resurrection appearances of Jesus, which go on for 40 days within a fairly small radius of Jerusalem, the normal approach is this is a complete, unprecedented miracle that defies all normal human thought and utterly incredible to anyone who doesn't believe this on faith and believing it because it's impossible, being in a sort of triumph of faith over reason and all that kind of thing. So it's normally treated as utterly miraculous and unique. But if it's seen in the context of after-death contacts, it becomes not particularly miraculous and not particularly unique. In fact, after-death contacts are common. I mean, millions of people have experienced them who are alive today, whose loved ones have died. So if one sees the resurrection appearances of Jesus as after-death contacts, then they become very credible. There's no need for some extreme leap of faith. Um, um, and you could say that this would, I dare say some conservative Christians would resist this interpretation because they want it to be unique and miraculous. And this makes it not exactly commonplace, but not something that's totally outside the normal order of things.
Yeah, I mean, I very much like that approach, in fact. And I mean, one thing that has always struck me is that Jesus's resurrection is not the only resurrection, even in the New Testament. There are three other accounts of resurrections in the gospel stories themselves. There's Jairus's daughter, there's Lazarus being raised from the dead. And so the significance for me is not that it happened, but it's the meaning of why it happened. And part of that is to inquire into the nature of the appearance of Jesus, because as you say, sometimes it seems very physical, and at other times not at all, either coming through walls, or of course when Jesus appears to the disciples but they don't recognize who he is. And that whole domain is much more interesting, it seems to me, than the sort of the bright lights of a blunt miracle. And in fact, this book, Leslie King's book, Surviving Death, she only very briefly at the end, but she says that perhaps one of the ways forward here is not to treat these accounts as kind of isolated sort of data points, a very reductive approach, as if you're sort of trying to prove something yes or no, but instead to feed them into a much wider picture of life and death as well. And so see them as building up a much larger account of, the nature of things. One of the ways that this might happen is that if you have other experiences that are outside of a regular materialist conception, then you have much better ways of accounting for what are otherwise thought to be anomalous. They're not actually anomalous at all, but they are just speaking to the wider perception of life than normally is operative in the secular world. And in fact, a New Testament scholar who I really like has picked up on this in relation to the resurrection of Jesus. He's called Dale Allison. He's a professor of the New Testament at Princeton University. And he wrote a very long book considering not just the accounts in the Gospels, but also the reception history of the resurrection of Jesus. And he comes to the conclusion that, as you say, appearances after death are actually commonplace. But what he does is he draws on other traditions as well to fill out the account of what might have happened. And in particular, he draws on the traditions that have noted that certainly amongst saints and sages, the very materiality of the body is often attested to become sort of more porous or less substantial. Probably the best known tradition is what's called the rainbow body in Tibetan Buddhism, where there's accounts of people when they die disappearing in a sort of light, as if the materiality of their body had become some kind of spiritual presence or energy that was perceived as light. And Dale Allison wonders whether that's a way of understanding the resurrection appearances of Jesus and why they had these different qualities at different times. And I very much like that approach because it is trying to build a sort of panoptic view of these things, rather than, as you say, invite people to make this kind of leap of faith that holds on to one ultimately, in terms of the empirical evidence, unprovable event. And because it's so long ago, it's why the discussion of the resurrection of Jesus just goes on and on ad infinitum. And so actually, if you do take that reductive approach to the resurrection as if it's the kind of crucial proof point of Christianity, you actually make Christianity much more fragile, it seems to me, because it sort of stands or falls on what you decide. When treated as this isolated incident is ultimately undecidable. But rather, if you see it in a much broader context, then it relates to your experience in the here and now, as well as what might have happened back then. and so beds it down in a much broader experience of life. And I guess that's why, coming back to terminal lucidity and other sorts of after death contact, that's why these things do connect up in people's minds and become, well, not just consoling in the sense of grieving and mourning, but consoling in the sense of expanding people's perceptions of life. Because death is a transition. It is a challenge. It isn't easy. Much as presumably our birth was a transition and wasn't easy. There's elements of pain and difficulty and uncertainty, even trauma involved. But having a wider context within which that might be held, and so stepped into, embraced, it feels to me is much, much more important than some rather narrow sort of proof point, as if life can be rescued if you can show that something 2,000 years ago happened for certain.
Quite agree, Mark, and I think that these studies on the natural history of dying and death um, are really helpful. And I think actually comparing it across cultures is very helpful too, because in many cultures there's a belief that after death people are still around for a while. 40 days is actually quite a common period, and like in Jesus's resurrection appearances. In India, for example, among Hindus, there is a series of ceremonies after death to help the soul pass on. And in South India, where I lived for a while, for years actually, um, there's one practice, I think it's at 40 days, when they put out a bowl of rice near the house of the person who died. Um, and if the crows and other birds come and eat it, it means the person's moved on. If they don't, it's because the person's still there, they're still present, they still want food and still are attracted to food, and the birds don't come near. And so they have a kind of empirical test to see whether people have moved. And if they haven't, then they do ceremonies to help them move on. So the idea that there's a period after death when people are still more present um, and I suppose when I mean in the Christian tradition there are funerals and then a requiem mass, which could be seen as a kind of a later stage, often weeks after death, would be a way of this next stage, moving on as the next stage. So I think there's the suppression of these discussions in a kind of secular materialist world has left a lot of people very unprepared. Um, but I think when we look at the natural history and also these cultural patterns that, because after all cultures have had to deal with death, it's a feature of every single human culture dealing with death and what it means and how the process takes place. Um, I think this will not just be of academic interest, I think it will be of practical importance in the dying process. And of course, since my years are advancing, I've got more personal interest in this than I used to have.
Yeah, well, it greatly engages me as well, partly because of having experienced the death of my mother when she was relatively young. And it's also something which I took from my work on Dante's Divine Comedy, that part of Dante's message is that the purpose of this life, at least in large part, is to become capable of what might follow. That we can use this life to prepare a more expansive perception of life in all its fullness, to use Jesus's expression. And because our capacity to engage with life is very much to do with our virtues, the qualities of our personality, our habits, as is often remarked these days, and what you see of life very much depends upon what you take to the act of perception. And so developing a capacity for openness and discernment in the here and now is good. But I've been convinced by Dante and the Divine Comedy particularly that it's going to be really valuable in terms of what happens next as well.
Mm.
So, not just the business of dying, but the business of living is caught up in this as well, and not closing that down. This is all very fascinating. Thanks very much indeed.
Well, thank you, Mark. We'll have to leave it there for now, but we may return to this at some stage in the future.